Xenobiologist Dr. Zerka adjusted his ocular implants with a quiet click, watching the human through the observation window. He had studied countless species across multiple star systems, yet nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing today. The Cosmic Harmony, a ship designed for multi-species exploration, was supposed to be a place of peaceful cooperation, an opportunity for various galactic races to learn from one another. Yet, as Zerka peered through the reinforced glass into the laboratory, he couldn't quite believe what his eyes were telling him. The human crew member, Sarah Chen, according to her insignia, was standing calmly in the center of the room, interacting with one of the most dangerous creatures they had in the containment area, a draconian viper hound. The viper hound, with its slick scales and rows of venomous spines, was known across 3 star systems as a fierce predator. Its neural spines carried enough toxin to paralyze a Kongan war beast in mere moments. To anyone else, approaching such a creature would be a death sentence. But Sarah Chen? She was casually touching it, running her fingers along its scaled back as though it were a tame pet. The viper hound, which should have been filled with aggression and distrust toward any species that came too close, was instead allowing her to stroke its body, even curling into a relaxed posture. Its usual ferocity seemed to dissipate in the presence of the human. What was happening? Dr. Zerka had spent years studying the viper hound, but he had never once seen such behavior. The creature should have been thrashing in panic, ready to strike at anything that came near. Yet, here it was, purring, its body softening under the touch of the human, emitting low, almost contented rumblings that Zerka had only ever heard from domestic creatures in Earth's historical records. Ambassador Tillox, are you seeing this? Dr. Zerka's voice vibrated with concern, his mandibles clicking together in disbelief. He could hardly process what was unfolding before him, but he knew it was critical. The human is making physical contact with the viper hound. Ambassador Tylox, a tall, blue-skinned diplomat with forearms and compound eyes, moved toward the window with swift, graceful steps. Her antennae twitched in alarm as she focused her gaze on Sarah and the creature. She stared for a long moment, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Impossible," she muttered. The thought of a human making physical contact with such a deadly predator was incomprehensible. The viper hound's neural spines contain enough toxin to paralyze a Kongan war beast. The human should be dead. Tylox's 4 arms moved urgently, one reaching for the emergency protocols that would initiate a quarantine procedure and contain the creature. But before she could press the button to activate the alarm, both she and Zerka froze. The scene before them shifted from one of danger to something far more puzzling. There, in the middle of the lab, Sarah Chen wasn't fighting for her life. She was calmly stroking the viper hound's back, her voice soft and soothing. The creature that had terrified entire civilizations was no longer growling or thrashing. Instead, it was leaning into the touch, as though it were some kind of domesticated animal. Zerka had studied every aspect of the viper hound's behavior. It was a creature designed by nature to be a killing machine, trained by evolution to be cautious, suspicious, and utterly hostile to anything that wasn't its own species. There was no logical explanation for this sudden change. In all his years of research, he had never encountered anything like this. "Ambassador," Dr. Zerka whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It appears to be enjoying the contact." Ambassador Tylox blinked in confusion, her compound eyes narrowing. She was a diplomat, not a xenobiologist, but even she could see the absurdity of what was unfolding. A predator, a creature that had evolved to strike with deadly force, was now acting like a harmless pet, responding positively to the human's touch. It didn't make sense. Yet, there it was. Sarah Chen continued to caress the viper hound, her fingers gliding gently over the smooth scales as if she were petting a docile animal. Inside the lab, Sarah's voice filled the space with a high-pitched, cooing tone. "Who's a good boy? You are. Yes, you are. she crooned, her voice tender and soothing. It was a tone Zerka had never heard from a human before, an almost motherly cadence that, despite the tension, made the entire situation feel more surreal. The human had never interacted with the Viper Hound in this way. Humans were curious creatures, but this was beyond anything Zerka had imagined. How could she do this? How could anyone? The door to the observation room slid open, and Captain Vroknar, the Athenian commander of the Cosmic Harmony, strode into the room. His steps were hurried and his exoskeleton rattled as he moved. "I received your urgent message," he said, voice laced with panic. "What's happening here? How is she still alive?" Dr. Zerka hesitated for a moment before responding, his mandibles clicking nervously. "We've been observing this behavior for some time. The human calls it petting. She's been performing similar actions with 8 other potentially lethal species in our xenobiology containment area." The captain's antennae twitched in shock as he looked through the window. "How can this be?" he murmured, his disbelief evident in his voice. "We've never seen anything like this before." Ambassador Telox was already accessing the ship's database through her neural interface. "According to human historical records," she said, her voice steady but curious, "their species has a peculiar compulsion to make physical contact with nearly every life form on their home planet, regardless of danger." She paused for a moment, processing the data before continuing. "This includes creatures that are deadly, like the Viper Hound. It's an instinct for them, almost like a deep-rooted need." Captain Vroknar's antennae twitched. Again, his concern growing. "Even with the dangerous ones?" "Especially the dangerous ones," Telox confirmed. She scrolled through the database, her eyes scanning the information quickly. Humans have formed symbiotic relationships with animals called cats and dogs. These creatures were once predators, hunting the humans' distant ancestors. And yet, humans have made these creatures their companions. "Unbelievable," Captain Vroknar muttered. "So, humans willingly touch dangerous creatures like this Viper Hound?" "Indeed," Telox responded. "And there are even documented cases of humans attempting to touch venomous sea creatures, massive herbivores that could crush them in a second, and even other dangerous predators from their home planet." Dar. Zerka leaned in closer to the window, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just learned. Humans were willing to risk their lives to touch anything. But why? What was it about them that caused such behavior? Did they not fear danger? Or was there something deeper at work? Some kind of empathic connection that allowed them to calm creatures that should have been their enemies? As Zerka continued to observe Sarah's interaction with the Viper Hound, the creature slowly and almost unwillingly settled into a peaceful state under her touch. It was something no scientist, not even Zerka, could explain. The human had somehow bridged the gap between species in a way no one had ever thought possible. And all it took was a gentle touch. The hum of the cosmic harmony reverberated through the corridors as Sarah Chen wandered through the ship's vast biological containment area. She had already spent hours studying various alien species, analyzing their unique behaviors and conducting experiments. However, something was different today. There was a sensation growing inside her, a stirring in her chest that demanded she go beyond the sterile observations of science and make a deeper connection. She could feel it in her bones, a deep-rooted instinct that had always guided her, an invisible force drawing her toward the creatures housed in the ship's pens. Sarah had always been curious about other species, but it wasn't just scientific curiosity that pushed her forward now. It was something more, something primal, as though the creatures themselves were calling out to her, yearning for contact. As she moved through the sterile corridors, Sarah's thoughts swirled around the events of the past few days. The humans, aboard the Cosmic Harmony, had been tasked with studying alien species for peaceful cooperation, but she had begun to notice something strange. Most of her crew members, even the scientists, treated the creatures they studied with a certain level of detachment. They saw them as test subjects, objects to be analyzed, measured, and categorized. But Sarah felt something different. The creatures on this ship weren't just subjects in a lab. They were living beings, each with its own story, its own complexity, and she couldn't simply observe them from a distance. As Sarah entered the observation room again, her eyes flickered over the various creatures contained within the enclosures. The walls were lined with reinforced glass, each habitat designed to mimic the native environments of the alien species. One pen housed a group of gliverash, the large sentient amphibians that communicated through ultraviolet patterns across their skin. Another contained the viper hound, a creature she had become particularly fascinated by. At first glance, it seemed like a terrifying beast, a creature with long, sharp spines and glowing eyes that sent a shiver through anyone who dared to approach. But when Sarah had first encountered it, something had shifted. She had been drawn to it, compelled by some instinct she couldn't explain. The viper hound was pacing, its tail flicking nervously, its body coiled like a spring ready to explode into action. It had been observing her since the moment she walked in, its keen, intelligent eyes following her every move. There had been an undeniable tension in the air when she first approached the pen. The creature was dangerous. Its venomous spines were a clear warning. Yet Sarah hadn't been afraid. A strange calm had settled over her, a feeling that had grown stronger each time she interacted with the creature. The first time she had touched the viper hound, the response had been unexpected. The creature, which should have recoiled in terror, or attacked in an instant, had instead leaned into her touch, its body trembling slightly under the sensation. It was as though the viper hound had recognized something in her, something that transcended species and instinct. She had been cautious at first, gently stroking its scales, unsure of what would happen next. But to her surprise, the viper hound had not only accepted her touch, it seemed to relish it. Its growls had softened into low, rumbling purrs, and its body had relaxed, a stark contrast to the aggressive stance it had taken when other crew members entered the room. Sarah had left the lab that day with a sense of awe and curiosity, wondering if this was simply an anomaly or if there was something deeper at play. Now, as she stood in front of the pen again, Sarah was determined to understand the connection. She didn't believe in coincidences, not when it came to her research. She had seen too many patterns in nature, too many instances where seemingly random events were tied to something much larger. The viper hound had shown her a side of itself no one had ever witnessed before, and she was certain it wasn't just a fluke. Slowly, Sarah reached out, her hand steady as she approached the edge of the pen. The viper hound's eyes locked onto hers, its pupils narrowing in focus. It took a step toward her, its body still coiled in cautious anticipation. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't back away. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice gentle, almost a whisper. "It's okay," she murmured, her hand extended toward the creature. "I'm not here to hurt you." The viper hound stopped, in its tracks, its posture stiffening for a moment before it took another cautious step forward. Sarah's fingers brushed against the glass, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The creature's glowing eyes softened, the hostility that had defined its species slowly melting away. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just a study. This was a breakthrough, an intimate moment of connection between two vastly different life forms. The tension in the air began to lift, and Sarah's hand pressed gently against the glass. She could sense the viper hound's hesitation, its wariness, yet it did not retreat. Instead, it leaned in closer, its spines lowered, its body language shifting from aggression to curiosity. The bond between them, though subtle, was undeniable. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that, for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend, this was no ordinary encounter. She was witnessing something profound. The viper hound was beginning to trust her. The creature's head tilted, slightly, its glowing eyes never leaving her face. Sarah's mind raced as she analyzed the situation, but at the same time, she could feel something else, an intuition that told her this was a moment she would never forget. The Viper Hound had not only accepted her presence, it had begun to trust her in a way that defied all logic. It was as if it could sense the sincerity in her intentions, the respect she had for its intelligence, and the bond she was attempting to form. This wasn't just about research anymore. It was about something far more significant, understanding the essence of another life form. For the next few hours, Sarah remained by the pen, observing and interacting with the Viper Hound. She spoke to it softly, offering her presence without demanding anything in return. The creature seemed to respond to her in a way that Sarah had never expected. Its movements grew slower, more deliberate, as if it were learning to trust her touch. And, as the hours passed, a strange calm settled over her as well. She had always been a scientist, driven by the need to analyze and understand. But today, she realized, there was something far deeper at work. The connection between herself and the Viper Hound was not something that could be explained by science alone. It was a bond formed in the silence between words, a relationship that transcended the boundaries of species and understanding. As Sarah left the lab that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something extraordinary. The Viper Hound, once a symbol of danger and aggression, had shown her a different side, one of vulnerability, trust, and connection. She didn't know what this meant for her research or the future of the cosmic harmony, but she knew one thing, for certain. She had just experienced something that defied all logic, and she was eager to see where this unexpected bond would lead. The discovery aboard the Cosmic Harmony was like a seed planted in Sarah's mind, one that grew with every passing day. She could no longer ignore the pull, the strange connection she felt towards the creatures she studied, especially the Viper Hound. Her days were no longer filled with the same sterile detachment that had defined her work in the past. It had all shifted. The desire to understand and categorize the species had transformed into something deeper. She had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer about merely recording data, but about establishing a bond, one that went beyond the surface. With every encounter, her sense of awe and wonder grew, particularly as her interactions with the Viper Hound deepened. Sarah had already noticed subtle changes in the creature's behavior. Where once the Viper Hound had been on high alert, its posture tense and defensive, it had begun to exhibit calmness around her. It no longer recoiled at her presence, but instead seemed drawn to her. Each day, Sarah spent hours observing the creature, speaking to it softly, sometimes even silently communicating through eye contact. Her colleagues, the scientists she once worked alongside, dismissed these moments as meaningless, a passing quirk of an intelligent animal. But for Sarah, they were profound. She began to question everything she knew about the creatures aboard the Cosmic Harmony. Could it be that these beings, which humans had labeled as dangerous and alien, were capable of more? Was it possible that a genuine, mutual understanding could exist between them and humans? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far larger than anything she had anticipated. The more time Sarah spent with the Viper Hound, the more she realized the creature had begun to change in other ways too. Its aggressive tendencies, once a hallmark of its species, were now subdued. Its behavior was no longer governed solely by instinct. Instead, it seemed as though it was learning, evolving in response to her presence. The way it tilted its head, when she spoke to it, the way it approached her with less caution, these were signs that something profound was happening, something neither she nor anyone aboard the ship could explain. Sarah's fascination turned into a quiet obsession. She began to keep a personal journal, recording every interaction, every subtle shift in the creature's demeanor. She carefully documented her feelings as well, an evolving sense of connection, of something growing beyond the realm of observation and analysis. The bond was starting to feel like something more than a human's fascination with the unknown. It was a two-way exchange, a conversation without words, and it was changing her in ways she couldn't articulate. One day, as Sarah entered the observation room, something unusual happened. The Viper Hound was waiting for her. It had never done this before. Normally, it would be pacing restlessly, its glowing eyes darting around as it waited for someone, usually a scientist or a guard, to approach. But today, as Sarah stepped inside, it stopped, its gaze locking onto hers in an almost unsettling manner. There was a pause, a moment where time seemed to hold its breath. And then, for the first time, the creature moved toward her without hesitation. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the Viper Hound closed the distance between them. It was no longer simply reacting to her presence. It was actively seeking her out. As it reached the edge of the pen, the creature extended its snout to the glass, as if it were trying to touch her. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen. She had never felt such an intense connection to a being before, never experienced something so intimate and raw. The creature's eyes glowed softly, a reflection of the quiet curiosity that seemed to radiate from within. Her hand, almost involuntarily, reached out toward the glass. The distance between them felt impossibly small, and yet it remained, a barrier of transparent material separating them. As her fingers brushed against the cold surface, the Viper Hound made a soft sound, a low, vibrating hum, something akin to a growl, but without the usual menace. It was a sound that felt almost like a greeting. Sarah's mind raced, her scientific curiosity kicking in. What was happening here? Was this behavior typical for the species? Had anyone else experienced something like this? Yet, at the same time, a part of her felt she didn't need answers. She had lived her life seeking explanations for everything, but now, in this moment, it felt as if some things were meant to simply be felt. The connection between her and the Viper Hound wasn't something that could be measured or quantified. It wasn't about proving a theory or making a groundbreaking discovery. It was something deeper, more visceral. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that despite the differences in species, there was something shared, an unspoken understanding between them. As the hours passed, Sarah's thoughts began to wander. What did this all mean? What was she becoming part of? In the silence of the observation room, the bond between her and the Viper Hound deepened. The creature began to approach her more often, responding to her presence with a kind of curiosity, a yearning for connection that mirrored Sarah's own. She began to realize that their interactions were becoming less about her trying to learn from it, and more about them learning from each other. There was something symbiotic happening, a quiet exchange of emotions and understanding. Her colleagues started to notice the changes too. They began to comment on the creature's unusual behavior, how it seemed to calm down in her presence, how it had begun to show signs of attachment. At first, Sarah had tried to explain it away, chalking it up to the nature of the species or perhaps the oddity of the circumstances. But deep down, she knew better. There was something far more extraordinary at work here. As days turned into weeks, Sarah felt herself slipping into a new rhythm, a new way of understanding not just the creatures aboard the ship, but the very nature of life itself. She had always believed that humans were the apex species, the ones who could unlock the secrets of the universe. But now she wasn't so sure. The Viper Hound had shown her something, that intelligence, understanding, and connection could transcend the boundaries of species. They were not so different after all. Perhaps in some ways, the humans and the alien species they had studied were far more alike than they had ever imagined. Each encounter with the Viper Hound felt like peeling back another layer of mystery, each moment leading her closer to a profound truth. The ship, once a symbol of isolation, now felt alive with possibility. The creature's presence no longer felt like an object of study. It had become a companion, a fellow traveler in the vast emptiness of space. Sarah couldn't explain why, or how it had come to this, but she knew that it had. What began as a simple scientific exploration had transformed into something far more personal, far more significant than anything she could have imagined. And for the first time in her career, Sarah felt that she was truly part of something greater, a connection not just to the Viper Hound, but to the very fabric of life itself. The culmination of Sarah's journey aboard the Cosmic Harmony unfolded as if the universe itself had been quietly preparing her for a revelation she had never anticipated. Her time with the Viper Hound had altered everything she knew about the creatures on the ship. What began as scientific curiosity had transformed into something far more profound. It was as if the lines between human and alien, observer and observed, had begun to blur in a way that defied logic. Sarah had often felt isolated aboard the ship, surrounded by colleagues who viewed their work as just another mission, another experiment. But the Viper Hound had changed all of that. The creature had opened something in her, something deep and unspoken. And in return, Sarah had given the creature something it had never known before: empathy, understanding, and perhaps, most importantly, trust. The transformation did not happen overnight. Each encounter with the Viper Hound had been a step forward in their growing connection. Yet, the more Sarah learned, the more she realized how little she truly understood. There was an uncharted territory between them, an invisible boundary that even she couldn't fully comprehend. It was not just a matter of language or physiology. It was something deeper, something that transcended the limits of their physical forms. The Viper Hound, with its strange, powerful energy and aggressive nature, had begun to soften, to become more than a mere specimen to be studied. Sarah could see it now. The creature had emotions, fears, desires, and perhaps even a sense of longing. One day, as Sarah approached the observation room, she felt a strange sense of urgency. It was as if something had shifted, something she could feel in the air before even stepping inside. The Viper Hound was waiting for her, as it had on so many occasions, but today it seemed different. There was a tension in its stance, an energy that hummed just beneath the surface. It wasn't the same creature she had come to know over the past few weeks. There was something more in its eyes, something that made Sarah's heart race with anticipation and a hint of fear. As she entered the room, the creature's glowing eyes met hers, but today, they didn't hold the same sense of cautious curiosity. Instead, they seemed to reflect something more profound, more urgent. The Viper Hound moved closer to the glass barrier that separated them, but this time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped closer, her breath catching as their eyes locked. The usual silence that hung between them seemed to stretch, pregnant with meaning. And then, to Sarah's shock, the creature did something it had never done before. It reached out toward her, its massive paw pressing against the glass. The gesture was simple, almost human, but it carried with it a depth of feeling that struck Sarah to her core. The glass barrier, once a protective shield, now felt like a cruel prison. The Viper Hound, despite its power and ferocity, was trapped. Within it, just as Sarah had been trapped in her own isolation. For the first time, Sarah understood the creature's behavior on a level she hadn't before. The Viper Hound, in its own way, was reaching out for something more, something that Sarah herself had been seeking since the beginning of her time aboard the Cosmic Harmony. Her hands, almost involuntarily, moved to the glass. She pressed her palm against it, mirroring the Viper Hound's motion. The creature's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt the weight of its gaze, a gaze that seemed to reach beyond the physical world and into the depths of her very soul. She had spent her career analyzing and categorizing, keeping her emotions at bay, but now, in this moment, everything she had ever believed about the sterile nature of science crumbled. There was no longer a need for analysis, no need for data. It was just her and the Viper Hound, sharing a silent moment of understanding that transcended any boundaries of species. As the days passed, the connection between Sarah and the Viper Hound deepened in ways that left her awestruck and confused. The creature had begun to show signs of attachment, not just to her, but to the ship itself. It had become calmer in its surroundings, less erratic in its movements. It no longer saw the humans around it as threats, but as part of its world. Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had changed within the Viper Hound, what had brought it to this moment of peaceful coexistence. Was it the bond they had forged? Or was there something more to the creature's transformation, something she hadn't yet discovered? One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the observation room, a soft, mechanical hum filled the air. The ship's artificial gravity system was working at full capacity, and the quiet vibrations beneath her feet reminded her of the vastness of space beyond the hull. But in that moment, she felt small. Not insignificant, but small in the way that someone might feel when standing before something much larger than themselves, something older, wiser, and far more powerful. The Viper Hound sat across from her, its eyes never leaving hers. For a long while, they sat in silence, both lost in thought. Sarah couldn't explain why, but something deep within her told her that the creature was waiting for her to make the next move. It had become more than a subject of study. It had become a companion, an equal in the journey they were both on. As the days blurred into weeks, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The bond she had formed with the Viper Hound had transcended everything she had been trained to believe. There was no longer a divide between her and the creature. They were connected in ways that defied logic and reason, as though the universe had conspired to bring them together. But this realization came with its own set of challenges. The ship's command structure had begun to notice the change in the Viper Hound. There were concerns that the creature's attachment to Sarah might make it more unpredictable, more dangerous. The idea of removing the creature from the observation room, of placing it back into confinement, was floated. For Sarah, this was the breaking point. She couldn't stand the thought of losing the connection she had with the creature. The bond they had formed was not something she could explain to anyone else. It was something that had to be felt, understood from within. The stakes had never been higher. Sarah stood at the threshold of a decision that would define not only her future aboard the Cosmic Harmony, but also her understanding of what it meant to be human. In the stillness of that room, with the Viper Hound staring at her, she knew that whatever path she chose would shape the course of her life. But as she looked into the creature's eyes, something in her heart told her that this wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger, a deep universal truth that connected all beings, all life, regardless of where they came from. The Viper Hound was not just a creature she had come to know. It was a part of the vast web of existence that stretched across the stars, and for the first time, Sarah felt as though she were truly a part of it too.